What happened in those 10 years? How does the girl they called too broken to matter end up being the one person standing between her brother and everything he thought he'd built? I'll tell you. But first, you need to understand what that night felt like. I was 22. It was February, cold enough that my breath fogged in the hallway of our house in Columbus, Ohio. My brother, my parents' golden boy, their firstborn, the one whose college acceptance letter my mother had literally framed and hung in the living room, had just finished telling me, in front of both of our parents, that I was an embarrassment, that every person who knew our family pitied them for having me as a daughter, that I had dragged the family name through the dirt because I'd been laid off from my receptionist job and hadn't paid rent to my parents that month. He said it the way you'd comment on the weather, casual, bored, like I wasn't even worth the energy of real cruelty. My father didn't say anything to him, not a word. What my father said was to me. He told me that if I couldn't contribute to this household, I needed to find somewhere else to be. That I was 22 years old and he wasn't running a charity. That my brother, at 25, had already bought his own condo and was paying off his car, and what did I have to show for myself? I remember standing there thinking, I haven't eaten today. That was the only clear thought I had. Everything else was just noise. I packed one bag. My brother was sitting on the couch when I came back downstairs, watching TV. He didn't look up. I stood at the front door for a second. My mother was in the kitchen. I could hear her washing dishes. She didn't come out. I left. It was 11:30 at night, and it was February, and I had $214 in my checking account, and one bag and nowhere to go. I'd like to tell you I had some kind of plan, that I knew even then I was going to be okay. But that's not how it felt. It felt like the floor had opened up under my feet and I was just falling, and nobody had even bothered to watch. I slept in my car that first night, parked outside a Target because it was well lit and felt safe. I reclined the seat back and put my coat over myself like a blanket and stared at the ceiling and did not cry. I was past crying by then. I was somewhere underneath crying. The next morning, I drove to a diner, ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, coffee and one egg, and sat in the booth for 2 hours because it was warm. The woman who kept refilling my coffee didn't say anything. She just kept refilling it. I have thought about her a lot over the years. Within a week, I had found a room to rent. $450 a month, cash, in a house with 3 other people I didn't know. The room was small enough that if I sat in the middle, I could touch both walls if I stretched my arms out. There was no closet. I hung my clothes on a tension rod I bought at the dollar store. I got a job at a shipping warehouse on the east side. Night shifts, loading and unloading trucks. It paid $12 an hour, which in 2014 felt like just barely enough to survive, because it was just barely enough to survive, because it was just barely enough to survive. I wore steel-toed boots I found at Goodwill and came home smelling like cardboard and industrial lubricant and fell asleep before I could even shower some nights. I want you to sit with that for a second, because this is the part people skip over, the actual grind of it, the monotony, the exhaustion that doesn't go away even after you sleep, the way you start eating the same cheat meals on rotation because you've done the math and it's the only way the numbers work. Rice and canned beans and whatever was on sale. I ate a lot of peanut butter sandwiches. I had a hot plate in my room and I used it every single day. My grandmother called me sometimes, my father's mother. She was the only one in the family who had my number, because she was the only one who had asked for it. She'd send me $20 on my birthday tucked into a card and tell me she was proud of me, and I would hold the phone away from my face so she couldn't hear me trying not to fall apart. I didn't call my parents. They didn't call me. I did go to a free clinic once, the Nationwide Health Center on Cleveland Avenue, because I had a respiratory infection that had lasted 3 weeks and I couldn't afford a regular doctor visit. They saw me, gave me a prescription, and a sliding scale charge of $15 based on my income. I paid it. I want to be clear about that. I paid it. It wasn't charity. It was a system designed to work for people in my situation, and I used it and I paid what I could, and I am still grateful for it. I don't want you to feel sorry for me during this part. I want you to understand it, because it matters for what comes later. You can't understand where I ended up without knowing what the floor looked like. The turn happened slowly. Those things always do. I had started taking free online courses, mostly because I couldn't afford cable. My laptop was old enough that streaming was a disaster, and I needed something to fill the hours when I wasn't working. I started with basic bookkeeping because there was a free certification course, and I figured, numbers are numbers. At least this is practical. Then I found project management. Then I found operations. Then, almost by accident, I found logistics technology. The software systems that run warehouses, that track inventory, that optimize shipping routes. I was literally working in a warehouse, and I started to understand the system I was working inside. I spent 18 months consuming everything I could find on supply chain software. I got a job as a data entry clerk at a mid-sized logistics firm in Columbus. Entry level. Paid $14.50 an hour. I wore the one blazer I owned to my interview. I had pressed it the night before with a hair straightener because I didn't own an iron. 3 years later, I was their operations coordinator. 2 years after that, I was their operations manager. I had a salary, I had health insurance. I had paid off the last of the small debts I'd accumulated in that first desperate year, and I had started to see a gap. The software that most small and mid-sized logistics companies used was outdated, expensive, and not designed for the way those businesses actually operated. The big players had custom systems. Everyone else was patching together tools that didn't quite fit and losing money in the inefficiency. I knew what that looked like from the inside. I had lived it from both sides of the workflow. I spent a year building a plan, found a technical co-founder through a meetup. His name was Marcus, and he was the kind of person who could translate what I was seeing operationally into actual software architecture. We were a good match. He built things. I knew what needed to be built and why. We called the company Gray Line Systems. We bootstrapped for the first year. I had saved enough by then to take the risk. Barely. I remember the month where our runway was 11 days, and we were waiting on a contract to close, and I didn't sleep more than 4 hours any night that week. The contract closed, we made payroll, we kept going. By the time Gray Line was 4 years old, we had 31 employees, contracts with companies in 7 states, and a platform that industry publications had started covering. We weren't a unicorn, we weren't a household name, but we were real and we were profitable, and we had built something that worked. I was 32 years old. I had not spoken to my parents in 10 years. I had spoken to my brother exactly once. A brief, strange phone call about 3 years after I left, when he'd somehow gotten my number and called to tell me our grandfather had passed. He'd said, "I thought you should know," in a tone that made clear he didn't feel strongly either way about whether I did. I said thank you. He hung up. That was it. I had spent those 10 years building a life that had nothing to do with any of them. I had a good apartment in the Short North neighborhood in Columbus. I had a therapist I'd been seeing for 4 years who had helped me understand a lot of things about my family that I hadn't had language for before. I had a small, solid group of friends. I had a life that felt genuinely mine, maybe for the first time ever. And then one Tuesday afternoon in October, my assistant knocked on my office door and said I had a walk-in applicant asking to speak to someone in leadership directly. Walk-ins are unusual. We don't really do that. But she said the man was well-dressed and had mentioned he'd driven from Cincinnati for the meeting and asked if I could spare 10 minutes. I said, "Sure. Give me 5." He came in and sat down across from my desk. It took me 4 seconds. My brother had gotten heavier, and his hair was shorter, and he was wearing a suit I didn't recognize. Navy blue. Looked expensive. But the way he sat, the slight lean back, the chin slightly up, the look that said he expected to be accommodated, that hadn't changed at all. He hadn't recognized me yet. He was looking slightly past me, at the window, the way some people do when they're composing themselves before a meeting. I said, "What can I help you with?" He looked at me then. Really looked. And I watched his face go through about 6 different things in under 2 seconds. He said my name. Just my first name. Like a question. I said, "Yes." He said, and I remember this precisely. "Oh, wow. I didn't realize. I mean, I knew a woman founded this company, but I didn't know it was." And then he stopped. I waited. He cleared his throat. He told me he'd been a senior operations director at a company in Cincinnati for the past 5 years, and that the company had recently been acquired and his position eliminated. He was looking for something new. He'd heard about Greyline through a contact. He thought his experience could be a strong fit. He was very professional about it. Composed. The presentation was good. When he finished, I looked at him for a moment. I said, "I appreciate you coming in. We do have a senior operations role open. I'll have HR send you our formal application. Everything goes through the same process: panel interview, skills assessment, references. If you're interested, submit your materials and someone will be in touch within 2 weeks." He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else, something more personal. I could see it. I didn't give him an opening. I stood up. I extended my hand. He shook it. I walked him to the door. That was it. He applied. He went through the process. His materials were strong. His experience was real. The panel gave him high marks. I was not on the panel. I had recused myself without explaining why. I told my HR director that I had a personal connection to the candidate and needed to stay out of the evaluation. She's good at her job. She didn't ask questions. He made it to the final round. And then his references came back, and one of them, a former colleague, mentioned, offhand, in the reference conversation, that he had a pattern of taking credit for team contributions and had created some difficult dynamics on his last 2 teams. We hired someone else. I want to be honest. I don't know what I would have done if his references had been clean. I have thought about it. I genuinely don't know. I think I would have let the process play out. I think I would have trusted my team's judgment. But I also think I would have been very clear, if he'd been hired, about what the expectations were, and I would not have carried his weight for him. It didn't come to that. He sent me an email after he got the rejection. It was 2 paragraphs long. The first paragraph was professional, thanking us for the opportunity, saying he understood, wishing the company well. The second paragraph started with, "I also wanted to say," and then was something about how he knew things had been difficult between our family and me, and that he hoped we could eventually talk. I read it twice. I did not respond to the second paragraph. I responded only to the first. I told him I appreciated his professionalism throughout the process and wished him well in his search. That was 6 months ago. My father called me 3 weeks after that. He had gotten my number from, I still don't know how. My grandmother had passed 2 years prior, so it wasn't her. I suspect my brother gave it to him. It was a Saturday morning. I was making coffee. I almost didn't answer because I didn't recognize the number, but something made me pick up. He said my name. His voice sounded older. I hadn't heard it in 10 years and it sounded genuinely older and smaller somehow, and something in my chest responded to that before my brain caught up. He said he'd heard I was doing well, that he'd looked up the company, that he used the word proud, and I heard him stumble slightly on it like it cost him something to say. I stood in my kitchen holding my coffee and I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said, "I'm glad the company is doing well." Not, "Thank you." Not, "I'm glad you called." Not, "We should catch up." Just that. He said he thought about me a lot. That he knew he hadn't. And then he paused. He said he knew he hadn't, and then he paused. He said he knew he hadn't handled things well. I said, I know. Another silence. He said, your brother is going through a hard time. And there it was. That's why he was calling. Not really for me. For my brother. To ask me to… what, exactly, I wasn't sure. To help. To give him a job. To be the bigger person in a way that would make their lives easier. I said, I'm sorry to hear that. I hope things improve for him. He said, maybe you could. I said, Dad. And the word felt strange in my mouth, like something I'd forgotten how to pronounce. I have to go. He said, okay. He said, okay. He said to take care. I said I would. I hung up. And I stood there in my kitchen with my coffee going cold, and I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel like I'd won anything. I felt quiet, like a room after everyone's left, not lonely, just still. Here's the thing no one tells you about this kind of story. People want the big scene. They want the confrontation, the dramatic reversal, the moment where you say the perfect thing and watch the person who hurt you finally understand the weight of what they did. But that's not how it happened. And honestly, I think quiet is better. My brother didn't beg. My father didn't break down. Nobody apologized on their knees. What happened was simpler and, I think, more true. They had to come to me. They had to cross a distance they had created. They had to sit across from me or call my phone number and recognize, in some way they couldn't avoid anymore, what they had thrown away on that February night 10 years ago. And I didn't perform anything for them. I didn't rage. I didn't cry. I didn't give a speech about everything I'd been through. I just existed as myself. In a life I had built from the ground up with my own hands, starting from $214 and a car and a parking lot outside a Target. That's the whole story. My therapist once asked me what I would want my younger self to know. I thought about it for a long time before I answered. I said, you're not what they decided you were. You never were. The verdict they handed down in that house, it was theirs, not yours. You don't have to carry it. You don't have to fight it either. You just have to outlive it, and you will. I promise you, you will. I've thought a lot about what it actually means when someone's life falls apart at 22. Not the dramatic version, not the movie version where the music swells and the hero walks away looking determined. The real version. The version where you're sitting in a reclined car seat outside a Target at midnight because it's the safest lit parking lot you could find, and you're not thinking about your future or your potential or any of that. You're just thinking about how cold it is and whether the doors are locked. That's where I was. That's what my family's choices put in motion. Here's what I've come to understand. Slowly, over 10 years, the way people treat you tells you exactly who they are. But it also creates a set of conditions you then have to live inside. My father's words that night weren't just cruel. They were a set of coordinates. They placed me at the bottom of something and left me there. What I did with those coordinates was entirely up to me. I don't say that to make it sound easy. It wasn't. There were months where I was so tired I cried in the car on the way to a warehouse shift because I had nothing left. There were nights I ate peanut butter out of the jar because I'd done the math on my checking account, and that was the calculation. Resilience isn't pretty while it's happening. It's mostly just endurance, showing up, not quitting on a Tuesday when everything in you wants to. But something happens when you keep going anyway. When you take one free online course because you can't afford cable and it turns into a certification, and that turns into a different job, and that turns into something you actually built. The accumulation of small, unglamorous choices. That's what a life is made of. Not the grand moment, the Tuesday, the Wednesday, the Thursday where nothing changed but you didn't stop. My brother walked into my office believing he was owed something. That's what a decade of being the favorite does. It trains you to expect the door to open before you knock. He sat across from me and I watched him do the math in real time. watched his face rearrange itself around the fact that the person behind the desk was me. The girl they thrown out. The failure. He didn't get the job. Not because I intervened. I recused myself completely, let the process run without me. He didn't get it because his references told the truth about who he was. That's the thing about character. It has a way of surfacing eventually in the accounts other people keep of you. My father called because he needed something from me. I think he also genuinely felt something close to regret. I'm not dismissing that. But I notice what he led with. Not, I'm sorry. Not, I was wrong, but your brother is going through a hard time. Even in his reaching out, someone else's need came first. I didn't have a speech ready for that. I didn't need one. What I've learned, what I want to leave you with, is this. You cannot build a life while you're performing one for the people who hurt you. The day I stopped waiting for my father to change his verdict, stopped trying to prove something to my brother, stopped measuring myself by the standard of a family that had already decided what I was worth, that was the day I actually started. Not the day I left. The day I let go. Integrity isn't about being seen. It's about what you do in the parking lot at midnight when nobody's watching and you're not sure how anything is going to work out. Wisdom isn't a moment. It's the slow accumulation of every time you chose honesty over convenience, patience over resentment, forward over back. I'm not standing here telling you the story has a perfect ending. My family is still my family. That doesn't resolve cleanly. But I have a life. A real one. One I built myself with my own hands, starting from almost nothing. And that nobody can take from me.